Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on Canada and US Gateway to Global Business and Immigration. My name is Eve Redican, and I am the Marketing and Communication Coordinator here at Green and Spiegel, and I am delighted to be your moderator for this session. Established in 1962, Green and Spiegel is Canada's oldest and largest immigration law firm and one of the most experienced in North America. With a dedicated team of over 200 individuals, including over 40 lawyers and attorneys, focusing exclusively on immigration law, Green and Spiegel is widely regarded as the foremost authority in the field for those with immigration needs in North America. Today, we're fortunate to have three esteemed experts from Green and Spiegel with us. We have Stephen Green, who is one of the two managing partners at Green and Spiegel and is certified as a specialist in immigration law by the Law Society of Ontario. With over 35 years of experience in immigration law, Stephen has extensive knowledge across all areas of Canadian immigration. He's widely recognized as a leading practitioner and subject matter field expert in the field. We also have Eren Sari, who is the Senior Manager of Business and Immigration and Development at Green and Spiegel. Eren specializes in global investor immigration services and plays a key role in connecting professionals across Canadian immigration options. And finally, we have Benjamin Green, who is a senior associate lawyer at Green and Spiegel in both our Toronto, Ontario, and Philadelphia, Pennsylvania offices. Benjamin assists businesses with long-term workforce planning, including corporate employee transfers, creative market solutions, and navigating the interconnected nature of the Canadian and American labor markets. Throughout the session, our speakers will cover the strategic advantage of doing business in Canada and the US, key immigration pathways, including Canada's startup visa and work permit options, and insights into US immigration options for businesses entering the American market. We'll also have a Q&A session at the end of the presentation, so please feel free to leave your questions in the chat. Now, without further ado, let's get started, and please join me in welcoming our first speaker, Stephen Green.
Good morning, good afternoon to everybody. As you can see from the agenda, we are going to be talking about various ways to enter Canada, both from a permanent and temporary perspective, and we'll also cover the same types of concepts through the immigration system of the United States. So let's go to the next slide and talk about these two concepts. In Canada, we have two types of pathways to enter. One is a temporary person, and one is a permanent person. And when I talk about temporary entry, that means that someone's coming into Canada for a specific period of time, and once they have concluded their visit, whatever they are entering Canada for, then they will return back home. And that's why it's called a temporary pathway, because I'm coming to Canada for a temporary purpose. The next area are people that want to come here and stay here for the rest of their lives. And those are permanent pathways, meaning that I have decided that I wish to make Canada my permanent home and leave my previous residence that I have had. So let's start with a few of the concepts under the temporary resident idea. The Canadian government reviewed temporary entries for people that are coming here for a short period of time. They felt that sometimes it was too burdensome for someone to apply for a work permit, and it was just really not facilitative with respect to that person or assisting the business inside of Canada. So they decided to create this concept for short duration abilities of people to enter Canada and actually work. And what this is, it's under a special program called Global Skills Strategy. And the government says that if you need to come to Canada for a short period of time and you are a highly skilled person, you can enter Canada and work as a visitor. And the two options available to you are to enter Canada as a senior skilled person, and you stay for up to 15 days and do your special project. Then you must leave Canada after the 15 days, and you are not permitted to come back for at least 6 months, and then you can re-enter again for up to 15 days. So in every year, you are permitted to enter twice to a maximum of 15 days each time, and there must be a 6-month break. But sometimes people are involved in a project that may be up to 4 weeks long. And the government says, okay, we'll let you enter as a business visitor, and you can stay for up to 30 days in the year, and then you must leave. So it's really for highly skilled people that are coming and being involved in a short-term project, and they are permitted to work during that 30-day period or 15-day period on their visitor entry document and be paid. So it's an exemption to really help businesses inside of Canada get the help they need for a very brief period of time from highly skilled individuals. But sometimes there's situations where someone must enter Canada for a longer period of time. And one of the options available to them is something called the intercompany transfer. And what that is the Canadian government recognizing that people that are senior managers or senior executives or people with specialized knowledge that are currently working for a company outside of Canada in that senior executive position or managerial position or specialized knowledge position can come to Canada and transfer up to Canada. It is limited only to those 3 types of individuals. The person must also have a minimum of 1 year full-time work experience within the previous 3 years before they can transfer up to Canada. So it's really for large sort of multinational companies where they may have a CEO that's working in the United States and they wish to transfer that CEO up to Canada. They would demonstrate that that CEO is currently working for the company in the United States, that that CEO has done that work for at least 1 year in the past 3, and of course, they are performing the duties of a CEO. And you do not need to test the labor market, which we'll talk about in a second, to enter. Also, the government provides companies that are overseas that wish to start up a division or branch office to use this intercompany transfer startup concept. So what that means is that if I am, for example, a senior manager in a company in Europe, I have worked for that company for at least 1 year in the past 3 as a senior manager, and I'm currently working for that company. My company can send me to Canada to establish a new branch office, and I would be able to come and work in Canada based on the intercompany startup provisions. So the intercompany transfer one talks about a company that is located outside of Canada that currently has a branch office in Canada, and I'm transferring to that existing branch office. The ICT startup, intercompany transfer startup, is one where the company now wants to establish a new entity inside of Canada, and I'm going to be the one to do that. Work permits that are issued under these provisions are provided for various periods of time. If you are involved in the intercompany transfer, where you're the senior manager coming to an existing establishment inside of Canada, if you come as a manager, you're permitted to obtain a work permit for up to 7 years. If you're coming as specialized knowledge, it's limited to 5 years. If you're doing the intercompany startup, generally, immigration will give you a work permit for 1 year to start because they want to make sure that you're really going to do this startup. And then after you've operated for that 1 year, you can apply for extensions for another 4 years if you are a senior manager, or another 6 years if you are, another 4 years if it's specialized knowledge, and another 6 years if you are a senior manager. So again, it's a very useful tool for a lot of companies that want to come up here. Now, the next area to get a work permit, which is more difficult than the intercompany transfer, is something called a labor market impact assessment. And what that is that in order to come into Canada, the employer who is looking for assistance from a foreign worker must test the Canadian labor market first. And what do I mean by that? They must go ahead and attempt to recruit to see if they can find a Canadian citizen, a permanent resident, or even perhaps a person that's a refugee claimant here in Canada. And they must attempt to do that for a period of a month in various sources, which are set up by the government that you must use. And after a month of not being able to find someone, then you are able to make an application to the Canadian government indicating that, hey, we attempted as an employer to try to find someone. We weren't able to find someone for the skills we need, and we have now located a foreign worker outside of Canada that we think would meet our needs. If you are able to satisfy the Canadian government that there is a labor shortage in this particular skill set, then the employer would be issued this LMIA, and then the employee, the potential employee, would use that LMIA to apply for a temporary work permit to enter Canada. And remember that just because you get an LMIA does not mean that the foreign national is guaranteed a temporary work permit. They must still satisfy all the requirements for temporary entry on a work permit. And the LMIA is just one of those steps in the process of attempting to satisfy the requirements for temporary entry. And I talked a bit about the global skills strategy. And this global skills strategy is also within the LMIA processing situation. And the Canadian government has indicated that if you are in a very highly skilled LMIA area, they will process your LMIA in a very fast and efficient way. And they're looking at 10 business days to get this LMIA. And also, they will look at the types of recruitment regarding people that are in the global talent stream, and you may not have to test the Canadian labor market. And if you look at the next slide, you'll see that certain occupations called the Global Talent Occupation List, you don't have to test the Canadian labor market because the Canadian government is satisfied that there is a shortage of civil engineers, mining engineers, web designers. And what they've designed here is, they say, under the global skills strategy, we will issue you an LMIA for that particular job inside of Canada. And you do not have to recruit. However, you must sort of enter into an agreement with the Canadian government where the entry of this foreign worker under the list of occupations will help the company, will help Canada by perhaps setting up training for other Canadians that are working in the company. So it's kind of an agreement between the company and the Canadian government that if you are able to get an LMIA under the Global Talent List, then you promise as a company to do certain things to help the Canadian company expand with the use of this particular foreign national that's going to come into Canada under this global talent stream. So it's very useful, very fast, and it's really an example of the Canadian government recognizing the need to bring in highly skilled individuals as quickly as possible, and also an obligation on the employer to work with the government to expand their area of business to help train local people that are here inside of Canada. So the Global Talent Category B is a very helpful program for many companies that exist here. But the Canadian government also recognized that, you know, a lot of people want to come and work in Canada. They're in situations where they have family members and they want to be eligible to bring those family members with them. So if you are able to get a work permit in certain situations, they will permit you to bring your spouse with you, your common law partner with you, and all your dependent children under the age of 22. So again, this family member that comes with you would receive an open work permit, meaning that they could do any type of job in Canada except for a very few, while the main applicant is restricted to the particular employer if they happen to come through intercompany transfer, if they happen to come through the global skills category B. So again, it's recognizing the fact that we need skilled workers to come to Canada, where in situations where families are involved, the Canadian government will facilitate the entry of their spouse, partner, and children under the age of 22. And those are really the two main ways to enter Canada on a temporary basis. The next category I want to talk about now is entering Canada on a permanent basis. And these are people that want to enter Canada, live in Canada, and become permanent residents. They're not coming in temporarily. And there are really not that many areas available for people that want to obtain permanent residence or immigration, synonymous words, to Canada. And one of them is called the Express Entry System. And what the Canadian government did about 15 years ago was they recognized that we wanted people to come into Canada with high skills, but we wanted them to come in quickly. And we want to be able to control the amount of people that are coming into Canada. So we used to have a system where we had 1,881 occupations on a list. If you did one of those occupations, you could apply for immigration and there was no limit. So for example, if you were living in India, for example, and you happened to be an engineer was on that list, you could apply and you would wait for your number to come up. And sometimes it would take up to 7 years. And the government said, this is not appropriate. It's not fair to the applicant. It's not fair to the economy of Canada because we need people now, not in 7 years. And a lot of things change during that 7-year period. So the government canceled that program and they instituted this new program called Express Entry. And when the program was first introduced, the government said, we want to bring in people in an express way. We want to understand their background. And if they have the right stuff, we will plan to bring them into Canada within 6 months of applying and being invited under this system. And the government at the beginning was meeting that program 80% of the time. And people would go ahead and give the government information about themselves because the government was looking into this pool of candidates that are interested in coming to Canada. And the things that the government was looking at was your education, Do you have a high education? Can you speak English? Can you speak French? Have you ever studied in Canada? Have you ever worked in Canada? Do you have a brother or sister in Canada? Do you have a job offer in Canada? And if you had the right stuff, the Canadian government would invite you to apply for immigration based on those factors. And you were able to get immigration within, as I said, 6 months. The problem which is occurring right now, unfortunately, is that Canada had invited a lot of students here. Many students graduated. They were provided with the ability to work in Canada. And after they worked for a minimum of 1 year, they were eligible to go into this express entry system. And there are many, many people now in this express entry system. And the criteria, meaning the points that are needed, have gotten higher and higher and higher each year. And now it's becoming quite difficult to be invited unless you really have a high level of education. You have a minimum of, 1 to 2 to 3 years of Canadian work experience. Perhaps you even have a job offer. So it's becoming more and more difficult for people to be invited under this express entry system because the pool is so large. But again, it does exist. The government invites between 3,000 to 4,000 people every 3 to 4 weeks in this system. And that's what we currently have today for skilled workers. It's not based on the person's money. It's based on their human capital. That's the word that immigration uses, meaning what capital do I have in my person, my education, my work experience, all those things. And that's what it's based on. It's not based on your wealth. The next area is really the only federal program for business people. And it's called the Canada Startup Visa Program. It was established about 12 or so or 15 years ago. And what happened was Canada went around the world and saw what was happening in places like Silicon Valley, in India, in Israel, and said, wow, there's all these amazing startups. We would like to encourage those startups to come to Canada. And if they come to Canada, we hope that they will create jobs for Canadians. They will be able to compete on a global scale, and they will bring all kinds of innovation to Canada. And the government was smart. They said, you know what? We really don't understand the startup world, and we're going to ask for assistance. And we're going to ask for assistance from 3 types of organizations. And those organizations are going to help us determine whether or not the startup that's abroad, that's going to come into Canada, is innovative, is going to help create jobs for Canada, and is going to be able to compete on a global scale. And those 3 areas are on the next slide. And Eren, maybe you want to talk about what these 3 groups do and the basic requirements to enter the Startup Visa Program.
Yes. So as Stephen mentioned, Canadian government sought for help from these expert companies in Canada to identify the right innovation from overseas. And there are 3 types of companies in Canada that specializes in the startup world: venture capital funds, angel investor groups, and business incubators. For the venture capital funds and angel investor groups, the Canadian government mandated them to invest in the company that they assessed from overseas, invest in that company to bring it over and help them to achieve some traction in the Canadian market and North American market. Venture capital funds, since in its natural course, they are bigger than the angel investors and they are more institutional. The venture capital funds are mandated to invest 200,000 Canadian into the company that they support and provide a letter of support, which is needed for the immigration application of the partners, up to 5 partners in that in the startup that's coming over. That's the venture capital fund. And the angel investor groups, there are about 10 of them or 10, 15 of them that are designated by the government. Angel investor groups are a bunch of individuals that are under a certain organization, an angel investor group that invest into startups. And because it's individuals versus the venture capital fund, which is more institutional, angel investor groups are mandated to invest a little less than the venture capital funds. They are obligated to invest $75,000 into the startup and support them to get traction in the Canadian market and go global after that. The business incubators, there are about 20 to 30 business incubators that are accredited by the Canadian government. They are more like, to put it in simple words, they're more academic. And some of them are non-for-profit. For that reason, the Canadian government said, okay, you don't need to invest, but put them into your incubation program. If you support them, if you assess them properly, if you support them, and if you want to bring them to the Canadian market, these innovative startups, do so. So the business incubators are not mandated to invest, but they are mandated to put these startups into their incubation programs. Some have 6 months term. Some of the incubation programs are for 12 months. It just changes from one incubator to another. And that's how they pick and choose. And we work with multiple ones to help our clients to get a hold of a designated organization, one of these 3 organizations, and try to achieve a letter of support so they can apply for their immigration.
Right. And, it's very important that everyone understands that the Startup Visa program is not a passive investment program, meaning that if I am abroad and I and a friend of mine have an interesting startup, my friend really is the one operating it, and I'm just going to invest in it, I will be refused if I am just an investor. It is not a passive investment program. You must be actively involved in this startup all the way through until your immigration documents are issued. And that is the way this program is set up. And that's where most applicants run into trouble, where they go ahead and they go into this program. They may get a letter of support from one of these 3 designated organizations, and they aren't involved. They just went ahead and financed the startup. Those individuals will be refused. Also, because it's a startup program, speed is very important. And the Canadian government on April the 29th recognized that the processing was taking way too long. And because it is the only business program in Canada, they had far too many applications in the backlog. And it was taking up to 3 years to process these startup visas for permanent residence for people. So the government said on April the 29th, we are putting a cap. And these designated organizations now, from April 29th till the end of the year, are only permitted to issue 10 letters of support to startups around the world. So understand that in this program, you must be actively involved in the startup. And I guess my last comment I'll make before we let Benjamin talk about entry into the United States is that remember that I talked about 2 separate pathways. There's a temporary pathway and a permanent pathway. And in many respects, they don't have much to do with each other, in the sense that you have to look to see if you qualify under the permanent pathway, be it express entry, be it startup, or do you qualify under the temporary pathways? So if I do an intercompany transfer to Canada, that's a temporary entry. And if I'm thinking about permanent residence to Canada, then I have to find a pathway under the permanent resident categories to see if I'll be eligible to get my permanent resident document before my temporary document expires. And that's sort of how the program works. So now let's talk about the processes to the United States. And Benjamin, we'll let you take over from here.
Great. Good morning, everyone. As Stephen mentioned, I'll continue that narrative of there are temporary pathways to the United States and then more permanent ones. These US work visas, just to give a super high level overview here, are those temporary pathways. These are time limited pathways. The L1 visa, that intercompany transferee, or the equivalent of the ICT in Canada, is only issued for up to 5 or 7 years, depending on the category for the individual. What that means is that during that time, someone has to get from, if they want to stay in the United States, from these temporary positions to a permanent pathway to permanent residence and beyond. The H-1B is the most common work visa in the United States. It is given out via a true lottery. Every year on April 1st, hundreds of thousands of people worldwide are put into this lottery, and there are only 65 to 85,000 visas available. Both of these work visas require American corporate participation, meaning if I'm living in Norway and I have no American company wanting to sponsor me, wanting to put me in the lottery, employing me abroad to allow me to transfer through, there simply is no path for me to enter the United States to work. The line I'm constantly giving clients when discussing these sorts of things is the famous American quote, ask not what the United States can do for you, but what you can do for the United States. That's a common narrative we see in all US work visas, is the participation or benefit in the American economy to American companies. Next slide, please. So to, again, jump a little back here in terms of just entering the United States. There's the standard B-1-2 visitor visa. Many of you may even have them already in your passports. They're issued for 5 years or 10 years, depending on the individual, depending on the foreign consulate. This is just short-term entry, right? This is just entering the United States as a tourist, entering the United States for business meetings. You are limited to 6 months while you're there. And if you spend those full 6 months, you cannot enter for another year. You can't open a bank account. You can't start doing profound business in the United States. This is merely a simple entry visa to physically be in the United States for a limited period of time. These days, these are also quite difficult to get. These visas, depending on where you are in the world, are taking hundreds of days up until years. I think there was an article last week in either the Globe and Mail or the CBC, two publications in Canada, that said that almost ironically, given the close relationship between the two countries, Canada actually has the slowest wait times in the world for this visa. Thank you. So to get a little more in depth on that L1 visa that I mentioned, the intercompany transferee equivalent. Again, this is not PR, but like Stephen mentioned, with that ICT startup new office, the Americans have an equivalent of that as well, which is this new office L1. It allows companies that exist outside of the United States to transfer someone who's been working for them more than 1 year in order to start their American presence. The big dynamic I often deal with in clients in this respect is that you really have to have the business already ongoing in order to make this transfer and start supporting work permits in this regard. Meaning you need to have a physical space leased, you need to have US clients ongoing, you need to have the ability to hire Americans and support Americans with services. You will not be successful getting this visa if you say, hey, I've got this great plan. I haven't spent any money yet, but trust me, I'll do it when you let me open my office. That's not going to be a successful application. This business plan, it's almost a misnomer because while you do have to have a business plan for what you want to do in the United States, you kind of have to already be doing it. You have to be able to point to the officer, look at the demand for us already. Look at all my clients who I've worked with previously. I need to take that next step and service them and physically be there in order to get this sort of a visa. Next slide, please. So to move forward into the more permanent pathway, like Stephen mentioned, green cards. United States green cards are very difficult to get. There are two types of them, economic class and family class. Family class meaning my spouse, my parent, my sibling, my child is in a position to be able to support me and sponsor me for a green card. Or the economic class, meaning my employer or my corporate entity is in a position to support me for a green card. Those are the two primary ways that persons get green cards in the United States, and they take a very, very long time. Because the United States issues green cards in what they call internal categories, meaning certain people from certain countries can only get so many green cards. If you are, let's say, from India and you are being sponsored by your employer and you have not worked for this employer abroad, you can be waiting 7, 10, 15 years for your green card. There are other pathways we'll talk about shortly that can shrink that timeline a bit, but it's always important when I'm talking to clients about green cards, either through their employer or through a spouse, for example, to say, hey, you don't apply for the green card on day 1 and get it on day 2. The waits are quite long, especially if you are in one of those categories that is what we would call oversubscribed, that has a backlog, that can see you waiting many years. Next slide, please. So that main pathway that we work with clients in order to shrink that timeline is called the EB-5 visa. It's technically an employment-based visa, but in a lot of ways, unlike what Stephen mentioned for the startup visa, this is a more passive way to jump straight to green card, jump past any work permits, past any employment sponsorship, past the spousal need, and go straight to green card. Any nationality in the world can apply for this. However, you have to be liquid and making that investment into the United States in very specific categories and in ways. Most people that we work with are making roughly an $800,000 investment into what are called targeted employment areas. It is seen by the US government as a win-win, right? Where they are helping fund local projects, malls, development, real estate, and in exchange, they're bringing over immigrants who have the capacity to support this infrastructure and may want to start their own business or start bringing their children over and establishing themselves in the country. The key here, and the biggest problems I see with clients in the EB-5 space are those that are a little too aggressive in this regard and don't want to use the targeted employment areas and rather say, no, I want to invest more. I want to invest it in myself. I want to start my own company and try to get registered with this program. It's very difficult to do. There's a lot of red tape here. In the eyes of the United States government, a lot of people that are doing that are sort of skirting the win-win and trying to enrich themselves and get a green card. And it gets very hazy in terms of if that's the appropriate pathway for every immigrant investor. So in our mind, the best thing to do is sort of the safest thing to do. When you're investing this much money, it's just too risky not to work with the standard companies that have done this time and time again. Another factor here on the EB-5 green card is that they are conditional. What I mean by that is there are strings attached to your investment. The idea for the US government is that you are going to support 10 American jobs with your investment, right? You're supporting local workers. And the project you work with needs to be able to show that down the road, you have actually employed 10 people with this money. All the more reason, again, to work with a company and work with that targeted employment area that have that experience time and time again. When you're investing this much money, it's simply too great a risk not to. Lastly, on the EB-5 visa, I wouldn't be doing my colleagues a favor if I didn't mention that, again, like any other green card, these take time. We note here that China is the most subscribed category here. Most people using this service are from China. And as a result, again, it's not a case of apply for green card on day one, invest on day two, get green card on day three. This is still a process that takes several years to do, depending on what country you are from. It may not be done in 2 years, in 4 years. It really does take time. There's constant oversight that needs to be done with regard to the investment to make sure that they're meeting these requirements you need to avoid the worst case scenario here, right? Which is making the investment and then not getting the green card. Working with a lawyer in this regard and working with Green and Spiegel allows us to have that certainty that your investment is protected, both for you, your family, and the green card you hope to eventually secure. Slide, please. So I covered this sort of briefly already. That's just the two different types of EB-5. The more direct one, where you are responsible for the oversight and supporting American workers, or the regional center one that we do far more work with, which is, again, using a more passive investment model, working with American industry, working with American companies who have done this many times over to be pooled together and make a larger economic impact. That said,
Thank you so much, Benjamin.
Great.
So
we're almost done time-wise. We really have time for one or two brief questions. In the chat, one of the questions talks about the global skills, the talent list, and do I need work experience in that area, or is it just education enough? If you look at the global talent list, it has numbers beside the occupation. Those are NOC numbers, not numbers, and you have to go to the job description and see, do you do those skills? Can you do those skills? And there are also educational requirements in some of those. So you have to meet a substantial number of the main duties in that job description, as well as the educational requirements if they do exist. So that's important to understand in that area. But again, we're pretty much out of time now. I thank everyone for participating with us. We are certainly here to answer any questions. On the screen, you see our personal emails. You can certainly email each of us to ask any further follow-up questions or set up perhaps even a consultation to review your personal situation. I'd like to thank Eve for setting this up and all the participants that were here, Aaron and Benjamin. So everyone have a wonderful rest of the day, evening, and morning.